In 1858, on an isolated South Carolina sea island, the recently widowed Margaret Calhoun Ashford began a horrifying experiment at her rice plantation. To perpetuate her deceased husband's bloodline, she orchestrated a pseudo-scientific breeding program among the enslaved people she owned. 5 children were born, their fathers died under suspicious circumstances, and their mothers were sold away. This systematic brutality continued undetected for years until Union forces discovered the widow's meticulous records in 1862. What happened to these children whose identities were erased? If uncovering such buried truths matters, subscribe and join us in documenting these stories. The South Carolina Lowcountry in the year 1858 existed as a world unto itself, a landscape where geography and human ambition had conspired to create isolated kingdoms of rice and profit. The coastal region between Charleston and Beaufort stretched across a maze of sea islands separated by tidal marshes that flooded twice daily with the Atlantic's rhythmic pulse. These were not the gentle waterways of pastoral imagination, but treacherous channels where a miscalculation of tide could strand a boat in sucking mud for 12 hours, where water moccasins coiled in Spartina grass, and where the summer air hung so thick with moisture that breathing itself became labor. The great rice plantations that dominated this landscape operated as self-contained worlds, some accessible only by ferry during high tide, their isolation enforced not by distance alone, but by the natural barriers of water and marsh that made neighboring estates hours away despite being visible across the channels. It was a region where wealth concentrated in the hands of a few planter families who commanded hundreds of enslaved people in the brutal, exacting work of tidal rice cultivation, and where the nearest legal authority might be a day's journey by boat to Charleston or Beaufort. In such places, what happened within plantation boundaries remained hidden unless someone with power chose to look. And in the late 1850s, as the nation lurched toward sectional crisis, few people in authority were looking closely at anything beyond the political storms gathering on the horizon. Ashford Hall occupied one of these isolated sea islands, a private domain of 847 acres, accessible only by ferry from the mainland during the twice-daily high tides that brought the Atlantic surging up the channels. The main house stood on the highest ground the island offered, a modest elevation of perhaps 20 feet that nonetheless commanded views across the surrounding marshland and rice fields stretching to the tree line. It was not among the grandest low-country plantation houses, no columned portico or sweeping staircases, but a substantial 2-story structure of tabby construction, that distinctive coastal building material of oyster shells, lime, sand, and water that hardened into walls capable of withstanding hurricane winds. The interior held 12 rooms arranged around a central hall designed to catch any breeze that might offer relief from the oppressive heat, furnished with pieces that spoke to old money, if not vast wealth. Portraits of Ashford ancestors, imported carpets worn thin by generations of use, a library of agricultural treatises and classical volumes suggesting education without ostentation. Behind the main house stretched the operational heart of the plantation, the rice mill with its massive pounding mortars driven by tidal power, storage barns, stables, the overseer's cottage, and the dual rows of slave quarters built of rough timber with dirt floors and shake roofs that sheltered the 156 human beings whose labor made everything else possible. The rice fields themselves lay in the lowest ground, an intricate system of embankments, trunks, and gates that allowed planters to flood and drain fields according to the rice cultivation cycle, all dependent on understanding and harnessing the tidal flows that could be friend or enemy depending on one's skill and the capricious Atlantic weather. Edmund Ashford had died on the 14th of August in 1857, succumbing to yellow fever during an epidemic that swept the coastal region that summer, carrying off planters and enslaved people alike with the democratic cruelty of disease. He was 72 years old, married for the third time to a woman 43 years his junior, a man who had inherited this plantation from his father and managed it in the unremarkable style of his class and generation. His death followed the pattern familiar to yellow fever, the initial fever and chills, the brief improvement that offered false hope, then the hemorrhaging and jaundice that gave the disease its name, the black vomit that marked the final stage, and finally death within 7 to 10 days of the first symptoms. He was buried in the family plot on a rare piece of high ground near the main house, joining his first two wives who had died in childbirth decades earlier, while his 33-year-old widow Margaret stood in mourning black beneath the live oaks as the summer heat pressed down like a physical weight. Neighboring planters who attended the funeral expected she would sell Ashford Hall and return to Charleston society, perhaps to her family's modest townhouse, or to lodge with relatives until she might remarry. This was the conventional path for widows, particularly young widows without children, particularly when the estate carried debts that would challenge even an experienced male manager. But Margaret Ashford surprised them all by announcing her intention to remain at Ashford Hall and manage the plantation herself. Within a month, she had dismissed her husband's elderly overseer, a man who had managed the plantation's daily operations for 20 years, and hired younger replacements whose names would not be recorded in any documents that survived. Within 2 months, she had stopped attending church services on the mainland and had begun declining social visits from neighboring plantation families. By the end of 1857, she had effectively severed all ties with low country society and retreated into the isolation her island plantation provided. The first birth occurred in April of 1858, barely 8 months after Edmund Ashford's burial, and it was this timing that would later strike observers as significant. Caesar, the plantation blacksmith, was a man valued for his skill with metal and fire, responsible for maintaining and repairing every iron implement essential to rice cultivation, the hoes, the axes, the intricate mechanisms of the rice mill's pounding machinery. He was married in the way enslaved people understood marriage, a union without legal recognition, but acknowledged within the community, to a woman named Susanna, who worked in the domestic service of the main house. When Susanna gave birth to a son in the slave quarters on an April morning, the child's appearance immediately marked him as different. The infant's skin was notably lighter than either parent's, a complexion that, in the brutal calculus of plantation society, signaled mixed ancestry. Such births were tragically common across the South, testament to the routine sexual exploitation of enslaved women by white men who faced no legal or social consequences for their actions. What made this birth unusual was what happened next. Margaret Ashford, who had shown little interest in the enslaved population beyond the most basic management decisions, demanded the infant be brought to the main house within days of his birth. She announced the child would be raised as her ward, separated from his mother, and attended by elderly enslaved women she personally selected. She named him Isaac, after her late husband's grandfather, and had a cradle brought down from the attic storage where it had sat unused since Edmund's long-dead children from his first marriages. 3 weeks later, on a morning when the spring heat had already begun building toward summer's oppression, Caesar was working at the forge when the massive overhead beam supporting the bellows mechanism gave way. The beam, weighing perhaps 300 pounds of heart pine, crashed down onto the blacksmith as he stood at the anvil, crushing his chest and skull. The overseers, who arrived within minutes, reported the death as a tragic accident, the result of timber weakened by years of heat and moisture, finally failing at a catastrophic moment. Caesar's body was buried that same day in the unmarked area beyond the slave quarters, where enslaved people were interred without ceremony or headstones. Within 48 hours of his death, Susanna was sold to a Georgia slave trader who happened to be traveling through the region purchasing workers for plantations in the deeper South. The sale was documented in the ledgers maintained by Thomas Wainwright, the Charleston factor, who handled Ashford Hall's commercial transactions, recording simply, Susanna, female, approximately 28 years, House servant, sound health, sold to J. Whitmore, Georgia trader, $850. The transaction was unremarkable by the standards of the domestic slave trade that annually moved tens of thousands of enslaved people across state lines, separating families with the casual efficiency of any commodity market. But the speed of it would later strike investigators as significant. A mother torn from her newborn infant before her body had recovered from childbirth, sold away before she could grieve her husband's death, before she could question the circumstances that had taken everything from her in less than a month. The infant Isaac remained in the main house, attended by an elderly enslaved woman named Judith, who had been pulled from lighter duties to serve as his nurse. Judith was approximately 63 years old in 1858, her age having moved her from the brutal labor of the rice fields to domestic work that recognized her diminished physical capacity while still extracting value from her remaining years. She had survived decades of bondage by learning when to speak and when to remain silent, when to show emotion, and when to present the blank face that white owners expected from their human property. Now she found herself responsible for an infant torn from his mother, living in rooms of the main house where she could hear the widow Ashford pacing the floors at night, where she witnessed behaviors that troubled her in ways she could not yet articulate and dared not voice. The child thrived physically under her care, gaining weight and reaching the developmental milestones of infancy. But Judith would later testify that even in those earliest months, Isaac seemed unnaturally quiet, as if some essential vitality had been stunted by the violence of his separation. The pattern repeated in November of 1858 with a precision that would later seem impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Dinah, a house servant who had been trained from girlhood in the domestic arts that kept plantation households functioning, gave birth to a daughter in the slave quarters. Like Isaac before her, the infant's lighter complexion immediately set her apart, and like Isaac, she was claimed by Margaret Ashford within days of her birth. The widow named this child Sarah after Edmund Ashford's mother, and had her brought to the main house to be raised alongside Isaac under Judith's expanding care. The infant's father was never identified in any surviving records, his name lost to history or deliberately erased, but within 2 weeks of the birth, Dinah was sold to a plantation near Savannah. The sale happened so quickly that Dinah would have still been recovering from childbirth when she was placed on a boat and transported away from the low country, away from the daughter she would never hold again, away from whatever family connections she had built over her years at Ashford Hall. The efficiency of these separations spoke to careful planning, to a system designed to eliminate witnesses and sever bonds before they could complicate Margaret's designs. Among the enslaved community, fear began to spread like fever, a recognition that something profoundly wrong was unfolding in the main house, but without any framework to understand it or any power to resist it. By June of 1859, when a third child was born, the pattern had become unmistakable to those paying attention. Benjamin held the position of rice field driver, an enslaved overseer responsible for directing the labor of other enslaved workers in the grueling work of rice cultivation. The position required physical strength, intelligence, and the ability to navigate the impossible position of enforcing a white overseer's demands on fellow enslaved people, while maintaining some semblance of community respect. Benjamin's wife gave birth to a son that summer, and within the now familiar time frame, Margaret claimed the infant for her growing household in the main house. She named him Thomas, continuing her practice of selecting names from the Ashford family history. 3 weeks after the birth, Benjamin was beaten to death by Margaret's overseers in full view of other enslaved workers in the plantation yard. The official explanation given was punishment for insubordination, a word that, in the vocabulary of slavery, could mean anything from actual resistance to merely meeting a white person's eyes at the wrong moment. But witnesses would later testify that Benjamin had committed no infraction, had been working without incident, when the overseers suddenly set upon him with clubs and fists, beating him until his skull cracked and his blood soaked into the Carolina dirt. His mother, an elderly woman whose name was never recorded in documents, witnessed her son's murder and was forced to help bury his body in an unmarked grave near the rice mill, forced to continue her labor as if the world had not just ended, as if the system that had stolen her son's life would tolerate any expression of her grief. The widow Ashford now had 3 young children in her household, attended by Judith and another elderly enslaved woman who had been pressed into service as the workload expanded. The main house had taken on an atmosphere that the enslaved workers who entered it for their duties would later struggle to articulate, a sense of wrongness that permeated the rooms where the children were kept, where Margaret spent hours observing them with an intensity that seemed to look through rather than at the infants in her care. She had begun keeping detailed written records, filling ledgers with observations about the children's physical development, their skin tones, the shapes of their features, notes written in the pseudo-scientific language of racial classification that pro-slavery intellectuals had developed to justify the institution's existence. She measured their heads with calipers borrowed from the plantation's carpentry tools. She noted which child reached for objects first, which responded to voices, which showed what she called superior or inferior traits. The ledgers would later be discovered hidden in the plantation office, and they would provide the most chilling evidence of Margaret's systematic approach, proof that she saw these children not as human beings but as experimental subjects in some twisted research program only she fully understood. January of 1860 brought the 4th birth, and by this point the enslaved community at Ashford Hall lived in a state of constant terror, understanding that any woman might be selected next, that any man with skills or physical strength might be marked for whatever dark purpose the widow pursued. Rachel, who served as the plantation cook and managed the complex work of feeding both the main house and providing rations for the enslaved population, gave birth to a daughter that winter. The infant was claimed immediately, named Mary after another Ashford ancestor, and brought to join the growing collection of children in the main house. Rachel's husband, or the father of her child, was never identified in any records that survived, suggesting he too was murdered with an efficiency that had become routine, his death perhaps not even documented separately because the system had been refined to the point where these eliminations attracted no notice. Rachel herself was sold to an upcountry South Carolina plantation within days, sent far enough inland that when Union forces would occupy the coast 2 years later, she would have no way of knowing her daughter had survived or how to begin searching for her. The domestic slave trade functioned with a bureaucratic precision that made such separations nearly impossible to undo. Once a person was sold through the auction houses and transported across state lines, the chances of ever tracing them again diminished to almost nothing. Families shattered by sale might spend decades searching for loved ones, placing advertisements in newspapers during Reconstruction, appealing to Freedmen's Bureau officials, following rumors and fragmentary information that usually led nowhere. Rachel would become one more woman lost to this machinery of separation, her fate unknown, her desperate search for the daughter taken from her recorded only in a single fragmentary document that may or may not reference the same person. By September of 1860, when the 5th and final child was born, the nation stood on the precipice of civil war, and the Low Country Plantation Society had become consumed with political crisis and fears of slave rebellion in the wake of John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry the previous year. Samuel, a skilled carpenter whose work maintained the endless infrastructure of a rice plantation, became the father of Margaret's 5th ward child. She named this infant Edmund Jr., the most explicit indication yet of her delusional belief that she was somehow perpetuating her dead husband's lineage through these children torn from enslaved mothers. Samuel's death came within 2 weeks of the birth, and it departed from the pattern of beatings and supposed accidents that had characterized the earlier murders. He fell violently ill with symptoms that included severe abdominal pain, vomiting, and convulsions, dying within 3 days of the onset of illness. The plantation doctor, who was not Dr. William Hartwell, but a less scrupulous physician who asked fewer questions, attributed the death to cholera. But no other cases of cholera occurred that season at Ashford Hall or any neighboring plantation, an absence that should have raised immediate suspicion given cholera's highly contagious nature. The symptoms Samuel exhibited were in fact consistent with arsenic poisoning, a method that allowed for murder with a veneer of medical plausibility and that required no physical confrontation that might leave witnesses or evidence. His body would later be exhumed during the 1862 investigation, and though the toxicology of the era was primitive by modern standards, tissue samples showed evidence of heavy metal poisoning that the military tribunal physicians concluded was almost certainly deliberate administration of poison. Margaret Ashford now commanded a household of 5 children, ranging in age from newborn Edmund to 2.5-year-old Isaac, all of them cared for by elderly enslaved women who lived in states of exhaustion and terror. The main house had become a place of profound dysfunction, where infants thrived physically under adequate nutrition and basic care, but showed signs of severe emotional disturbance that came from maternal separation and exposure to an environment saturated with violence and fear. Judith, who bore the primary responsibility for these children's care, would later testify that none of them developed normally in their emotional responses. They were too quiet, too compliant, showing none of the healthy attachment behaviors that infants display toward their caregivers. They existed in a kind of psychological limbo, neither fully neglected nor truly nurtured, objects of Margaret's obsessive observation, but not recipients of anything resembling maternal love. The widow spent hours watching them, measuring them, recording their every development in her ledgers, but she rarely touched them with affection or responded to their cries with comfort. She was conducting research, as she understood it, documenting what she believed were scientific observations about racial characteristics and the effects of environment on development. That these were living children with needs and feelings seemed not to penetrate her consciousness, or perhaps she had deliberately trained herself not to see their humanity because acknowledging it would have undermined the intellectual framework she had constructed to justify her actions. Dr. William Hartwell had practiced medicine in the Low Country for 25 years by 1860, long enough to recognize patterns that others might miss, and to understand the limitations of his profession in a society built on slavery's brutal foundation. He had been trained at the Medical College of South Carolina and maintained a practice that served both wealthy planters and their enslaved populations, a position that gave him unusual visibility across multiple plantations in the Sea Islands region. He was called to attend difficult births, to treat injuries from the dangerous work of rice cultivation, to respond to disease outbreaks that could devastate plantation workforces and threaten owners' investments. His professional ethics distinguished him from many low-country physicians who viewed enslaved patients as mere property deserving minimal care. He kept detailed medical records regardless of a patient's race, insisted on proper treatment protocols, and maintained standards that earned him respect even from those who found his attitudes toward enslaved people peculiarly sympathetic. By late 1860, Dr. Hartwell had attended or been consulted on 4 of the 5 births at Ashford Hall, and the pattern had become impossible for him to ignore. 5 births in less than 3 years, all to different enslaved women, all resulting in light-skinned infants immediately claimed by the widow and separated from their mothers. The timing troubled him deeply, as did the circumstances, the rapid sales of mothers, the deaths of fathers in accidents that occurred with suspicious regularity, the widow's increasingly erratic behavior, and refusal of social contact. In his personal medical journal, a leather-bound volume he kept separate from his official patient records, Dr. Hartwell began documenting his suspicions in careful language that revealed both his growing alarm and his awareness of the dangerous ground he was treading. An entry from December 1860 noted, "Called again to Ashford Hall for observation of the 5 ward children Mrs. Ashford has collected. The eldest boy, approximately 2 years and 8 months, shows adequate physical development, but concerning lack of normal infant attachment behaviors. All 5 children exhibit similar patterns, physically sound, but emotionally withdrawn in manner unusual for their ages. Mrs. Ashford's insistence on detailed measurements and her peculiar terminology when discussing the children suggests some design I cannot yet comprehend, though I fear it partakes of the racial theorizing that has become fashionable among those seeking to justify our peculiar institution through appeals to science. Another entry from February 1861 was more explicit. The pattern of births, separations, and subsequent deaths of fathers cannot be coincidental. 5 enslaved men, dead within weeks of their children's births, all attributed to accidents or illness, yet the statistical improbability suggests deliberate action. I have attempted to raise these concerns with Factor Wainwright, who handles the Ashford accounts, but what remedy exists? Enslaved testimony is inadmissible against white defendants. Mrs. Ashford's position as respectable widow protects her from casual inquiry. The isolation of her plantation makes investigation nearly impossible. I am haunted by the certainty that great evil unfolds at Ashford Hall, yet I am powerless to prevent it. Dr. Hartwell's dilemma encapsulated the fundamental corruption at slavery's heart, a system that granted white owners absolute power over human lives, with no meaningful accountability, no legal framework for investigating abuses, no mechanism for enslaved victims to seek justice. Even a white professional of conscience found himself trapped by the very structures that enabled his own privilege. He could document his suspicions in private journals, could share concerns with other white men of business like Thomas Wainwright, but he could not compel investigation, could not bring charges, could not protect the people he knew were being systematically exploited and murdered. The law explicitly denied enslaved people legal personhood. They could not testify against white defendants in court, could not bring lawsuits, could not appeal to any authority for protection from their owners. A plantation owner's treatment of their human property was considered a private matter, and interference in such matters violated the sacred principles of property rights that formed the foundation of Southern society. Dr. Hartwell understood all this with perfect clarity, and the knowledge that his professional expertise meant nothing against the social and legal architecture of slavery would haunt him for the rest of his life. His journals, preserved after his death in 1878 and eventually donated to historical archives, would provide crucial corroboration for the investigation that finally came, but they also stand as testimony to how systematic evil could unfold in plain sight, documented but unprevented, because the society that witnessed it had deliberately constructed legal and social barriers against intervention.